So we have a pretty packed agenda. One thing that I wanted to cover before we get started is we're going to keep participants on mute during the presentation. And when we get to the Q&A session, we're going to invite people to speak. So if you would like to say something during the Q&A, mention in the chat that you would like, that you have a question, and we'll kind of facilitate that as a Q&A where you can ask your question. You get a minute to ask your question, and we'll give whoever's responding 3 minutes to respond. That way we can kind of keep stuff on track, but we can also have a conversation. I think that is kind of more in keeping with the kind of dialogue that we've typically been having as a CAG. So any questions about that?
One thing I'd like to add is, because as Matt said, it is a really packed agenda. We have a lot of information to get out there, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions to ask afterwards. We do have a second tentative meeting scheduled if we need it. If we can get it all done tonight, that would be great. But if we can't, we're going to regroup on Tuesday, the 27th. So not next week, but the following week, Tuesday, the 27th. If necessary at 6 p.m. again, because we don't want to cut anyone's questions off. This is a really important subject. Again, if we get it all taken care of tonight, then we won't need that meeting, but I just wanted to let everyone know, don't panic if you don't get called on tonight and you still have additional questions. So it's 6:08, we have 58 people on. Matt, I think we should get started.
I think so too. So first item on the agenda, we have Stephanie or Supinder, if you want to start us off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Vaughn. I'm with the EPA. I'm the section chief, and Supinder is going to be sharing a presentation, so you can get that up now. But maybe before we do that, we do have several people from EPA on the phone, so it might make sense, some are new faces, to introduce them. It's, as I said, I'm the section chief, Supinder Shekar.
Hey, I'm the remedial project manager for Rolling Knolls.
Okay. And then we have Angela.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It's been a long day, sorry. I'm Angela Carpenter, and I am the chief of the Special Projects Branch.
And then we have both the human health and ecological risk assessors on the line. That's three folks. Do you want to introduce yourselves? Michael?
Sure, I'm Michael Syvac. I'm the human health risk assessor for EPA, working on the Rolling Knolls Prevent site.
Hi, I'm Mike Clementson. I do the ecological risk for EPA for this site.
And I'm Rich Henry. I'm an eco risk assessor as well, but I work for the environmental response team, which is an organization within EPA.
Okay. And finally, of course, Pat Seppi is on. I'm sorry, Pat.
You're on mute, Pat.
I can never figure out how to do the video and the mute at the same time. I'm Pat Seppi. I'm the community involvement coordinator for the site. Thank you, Stephanie.
All right. And also, is Juan on?
He was.
Oh, and Rachel. I'm sorry, two more people.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm on. I don't know if you could see me. I hope you can. I'm Juan Fajardo.
Nose up.
And I'm the attorney for the site.
And who is the last
Rachel
person,
Griffith.
Stephanie?
Hi, Sally. It's me, Rachel Griffiths. I'm the geologist for the site.
Thanks.
Sorry, Rachel. All right. So with that, I'm not going to do all the talking tonight. I'm going to start things off and then pass off the presentation to some of the other folks on the line, and then you can put it up now, Supinder, please.
I'm trying to share it, but it's saying it's disabled share.
Oh,
I'll give you the sharing. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
And then we'll all be available for the Q&A. We can direct those as appropriate.
And just so everybody knows, we are recording the session. It'll be posted, I guess, on our YouTube channel. I'm not sure, but
Yes, we'll
certainly
post it to our YouTube. Yep.
we'll make sure that we post any PowerPoints on our website, and the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. We'll make sure you know how to get to that in case anybody wants to see it again, or if anybody that you know wants to see it, you'd be able to share that with them.
Okay, so you, I'm sorry, Supinder, you're able to share? Yep.
It says I'm sharing my screen.
Can you put it in presentation mode?
Trying.
There you go.
There we go. Perfect. All right. So next slide. Sorry, I can't talk and change slides at the same time. So, you know, there are a lot of folks on the line. Some of you are very familiar with the site, but I imagine some folks are newer to it. So we're very quickly going to kind of give an overview of the entire site and then spend most of the time on the FS, on the feasibility study, sorry. So very basically, the Rolling Knolls Landfill Superfund site consists of approximately 170 acres. It was used primarily as an unlined landfill from the 1930s to the end of 1968. And waste, and sorry, am I echoing? Okay, waste at the site includes, I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if anyone's not on mute, but I would appreciate it. Waste at the site includes, it's what you'd expect in a municipal landfill. There's household garbage, construction and demolition debris. There's some industrial waste, septic, scrap metal, and the thickness of the waste varies throughout the site. In some areas, it's up to 18 feet deep. In other areas, it's just at the surface. One of the things that makes the site interesting is that it has mixed ownership. The majority is owned by the Mealy Trust, by a private family. That is shown as pink on the figure that's on this slide. The areas that are that orangey color, it's about 35 acres of the 170, and that is owned by the Department of Interior and managed by Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. And then that small green portion is owned by the Green Village Fire Department. So there are 3 responsible parties that have, are conducting, 3 private responsible parties that are conducting the remedial investigation and feasibility study for the site, and plus DOI has been named as a responsible party. So next slide. I'm gonna walk you through the Superfund process, which is a long and sometimes complicated process, but we felt it was important to reiterate how that process works. So the first thing that happens is we look at a site comes to our attention, to EPA's attention, and it gets screened and a determination is made on whether it should be added to what's called the National Priorities List. And basically, once it is added to that list, it becomes a Superfund site. So for Rolling Knolls, that happened in 2003. Then we conduct what's called a remedial investigation and a feasibility study. And we're going to go into more detail on both of those aspects of the site throughout this presentation. And part of that investigation and feasibility study phase is also conduct of the human health and ecological risk assessments. Once we finish that phase, then we enter the next phase, and that is when we EPA feel comfortable with the documentation that it supports selection of a remedy for the site or for a portion of the site, and we prepare what is called a proposed plan. The proposed plan is based on the findings of the remedial investigation and feasibility study, and when that proposed plan is issued, it is issued widely and publicly, and it starts off a mandatory public comment period. So that is a very formal comment period with start and end dates. We accept comments, both written and verbal, during that period. And about halfway through it, we hold a public meeting, which is recorded by a stenographer. And we receive comments. And then once the comment period is over, we evaluate all of the comments received, and we put together what is called a responsiveness summary, responding to the comments. The feasibility study remains in draft form throughout this comment period, because some of the comments could, of course, impact the feasibility study. And then once the comment period ends and we've evaluated all the comments, we come out with what's called a record of decision. And that is a sort of our legal document selecting the remedy for the site or the portion of the site. Once the record of decision, or ROD, is signed, then we move into the rest of the work at the site. We start designing the cleanup of the remedy. And that design process is when we do most of our sampling, and we go in and we do a whole lot more sampling to refine how we're going to clean up the site. And we finally move into cleaning it up and ultimately, hopefully, deleting it from the NPL, from the Superfund list, or at least it becoming construction complete. So just to be clear, right now we are in that third box down. We are in the remedial investigation and feasibility study phase. We have not yet put out the proposed plan. Next slide. So this slide, I'm going to turn things over to Angela to sort of go through the goal of the remedial investigation.
Thank you for unmuting me. So the remedial investigation, as you can see from the slide, but just in case somebody is not able to see this, the remedial investigation, the purpose is to develop and determine if sufficient data exists for us to characterize site contamination. So its goal is not to find every last piece of contamination at the site, but enough information so that we can support moving to the next phase, the development of the feasibility study, the human health risk assessment, the baseline ecological risk assessment. Without the RI phase, of course, we really wouldn't have a clue as to whether or not we need to take an action. But it is not the definitive data collection phase. There's additional data, and a lot of it, as Stephanie was mentioning, that needs to be collected during the design phase. But the primary goals of the remedial investigation, and I think it is important that we all understand, what its purpose is to develop and define the nature and extent of the contamination at the site. Where is the contamination? What media is it in? What media are impacting other media? And what levels of contamination do we have? From this information, we then develop two very important pieces of the Superfund puzzle, which are the human health risk assessment and the eco risk assessment. The human health risk assessment is key because, well, as the name implies, it gives us an idea of what's going on for human health, and the same is said for the ecological risk assessment. But another important piece of that is it helps EPA to understand whether or not an action is required under Superfund. So these two risk assessment processes are key in moving the process from the remedial investigation to the feasibility study process. And you're going to hear a little bit more about them in the next couple of minutes. Another piece of this is the conceptual site model. We use the data that's developed in the remedial investigation to create a model of how we think the contamination occurs and impacts the environment at a particular site. And another critical factor in this is that we are also identifying for the future work what data gaps we think may need to be addressed as we move along through the process. So that's basically what a remedial investigation is all about. It's a way for us to collect information such that we have sufficient information to develop and evaluate effective remedial alternatives. And with that, I will turn it over to Supinder.
Sorry, thank you, Angela. It took me a minute to unmute. Okay, so fieldwork for this, for the Rolling Knolls site, for the remedial investigation was conducted from 2007 to 2015. This fieldwork was done to determine the physical characteristics of the site, what the geology is, the topography, where the groundwater, if there is any, can be found at the site, and also to characterize the nature and extent of the contamination for all media, which includes soil, groundwater, sediment, surface water, vapor intrusion, as well as for biota and ecological receptors. The physical characteristics of the site, which were found in the remedial investigation, for soil, the soil consists of organic matter, sand, clay, and silt, up to 25 feet below ground surface. And after that 25 feet, there is a thick clay layer. The groundwater was found to be shallow and can be found at about 2.5 feet below ground surface. And there are 3 ponds that are located on the landfill, as well as vernal pools, which are seasonal depression wetlands. And these 3 ponds do not seem to connect to any other surface body. There's also 2 surface bodies that run adjacent to the landfill, and they are Lowentaka Brook and Black Brook. And approximately 40 acres of the site consist of wetlands, and these wetlands are also designated as flood hazard zones, and the remainder, about 110 acres of the landfill, is non-wetland. And there are, the site has habitat for 6 species that are state and federal threatened endangered species, but they only found one, which I believe was the blue-spotted salamander. The sampling done to determine that, so what I previously mentioned was the physical characteristics. Sampling was also done to determine the nature and extent of contamination, where the contaminants are, what the contaminants are, and the concentrations. There were 57 test pits that were dug to determine what's in the soil, to investigate the composition of the subsurface. And out of those 57, 37 of them were found to have waste or debris, and only 3 of them had potential industrial waste. Along with that, there were 18 points of interest that were identified based on visual observation. These points of interest were unique compared to the rest of the site. There was also drums found at POI 1, point of interest 1, and those drums were removed. For soil, there were about 200 samples taken in, as Stephanie had mentioned, there's the ball field, the shooting range, along the landfill area, as well as background areas. So that was all covered, and I'll show you in the next slide. For groundwater, about 34 permanent and temporary monitoring wells were sampled. And for groundwater, the results had indicated that for most of the contaminants, the contamination was limited to certain areas and it wasn't widespread. There is one building located on the landfill, and that's the Hunt Club. There was soil gas collected at the site to make sure there wasn't any vapor intrusion, and that sampling indicated that there was none. There was also 47 locations from which surface water was collected, which was collected both upstream and downstream of the site, and the results don't indicate that there is much contamination. And there was also 47 locations of sediment sampling that was done upstream and downstream of the site. There was also biota and ecological tissue sampling that was taken at the site, and the sampling was done for the baseline ecological risk assessment. And so here's a map that shows the sampling that was done at the site. These are the 3 ponds that I mentioned earlier, this right here, and this one over here. I believe this is Loantaka Brook, and this is Black Brook that runs around. Sorry, this is Loantaka, and this is Black Brook. As you can see, sampling was done widespread throughout the site. And this map here shows soil samples that were taken in background locations upstream and upgradient and downgradient of the site. And from here, I will ask Stephanie to take over.
Thank you. It wasn't letting me unmute myself. Do y'all hear me now? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Supinder. So if you could go back to the back 2 slides just for a second to the, yes. I just want to reiterate that the samples were collected throughout the site, including, as you can see on the lower portion, on both the portion of the landfill that is on the Great Swamp, the wildlife refuge, you know, well below the pink line delineates where waste was found. So, you know, we went beyond those limits to really try to fully delineate the extent of contamination. And then if we go back to the table, sorry, let's get too ahead again. I just want to point out some of the findings. So this was the surface soil results. So we collected a total of 187, or out of 187 surface soil samples collected. If you go to the last column, there's a lot of information in this table, but if you go to the last column, so the first column are the contaminants that we detected the most. So when you run samples in a lab, you'll either find something, a concentration that's measurable, or it's non-detect. So these are the primary contaminants that were detected in the landfill, and the vast majority were found above soil cleanup criteria, just standard New Jersey soil cleanup criteria, at fewer than 10% of the locations. Some of these had single hits that were above screening criteria, and PCBs and lead were found at elevated concentrations at 36% of the locations, and arsenic at 13% of the locations. So these findings were very informative and significant, because what they told us was that the contamination at this landfill is not, the hazardous contamination at this landfill is not uniformly distributed throughout. While there may be municipal waste throughout the landfill, it was not necessarily commingled with hazardous contamination. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide. which Michael Syback is going to cover.
Thank you. I am unmuted, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we have just heard over the last couple of slides and discussions about the results of the remedial investigation. And as Angela explained earlier, that told EPA and the parties what the nature and the extent of contamination was and where that contamination was located. So with that information, we then move into trying to determine what are the risks to people and what are the risks to ecological receptors, the way the site currently exists right now, and the way the site might exist in the future based on what we believe to be the reasonably anticipated future land use of the site. So as far as what the site looks like now, that's easy. We can go out there and we can look and see how the site is developed, who has access to the site, how people move around the site, how people use the groundwater at the site, things like that. For the future, we did a land reuse assessment that identified the reasonably anticipated future land use for these various components of the site that we heard about earlier, the privately owned property, the property owned by the Department of the Environment, or excuse me, Department of Interior. And so from that, we were able to identify populations that would have access to the site. And then we were also able to determine what kind of ecological receptors might be present at the site. So it's important to understand what are the risks now and in the future, because as what was discussed earlier is the outcome of the risk assessments determine whether or not we need to take action to clean up the site. If the risk assessments conclude we have unacceptable levels of risk, and those unacceptable levels of risks are defined by Congress, they're not defined by me or by Mike Clemenson, who's going to speak after me, or by Stephanie or Angela or Supinder or anybody at EPA. They're defined in our laws. So once we determine if those levels of risk are unacceptable as defined by our laws, we then have the ability to determine that we need to clean up the site. And what are the goals of cleaning up the site? How do we reduce those unacceptable levels of risks to within acceptable levels? But before we can answer those questions, we got to answer what are the risks at the site. Okay, so next slide, please. So for the human health risk assessment, like I said, we looked at the current and then we looked at the reasonably anticipated future land use of the site. We looked at utility workers, we looked at construction workers, we looked at hunters, we looked at folks at the ball field and the hunt club. We looked at landscapers who were at some of the buildings on the site, on the privately owned part of the site. All of those risks on the human health side, both from a carcinogenic standpoint and from a non-carcinogenic standpoint, all of those risks to those populations were within acceptable levels, meaning they were not unacceptable. Where we came into unacceptable levels of risk was when we were looking at the passive recreator. The documents that we have, I also call this population a trespasser. But through our evaluation of how these two populations, the trespasser and the passive recreator, would be on the site, those two exposures are pretty similar. It's about 143 days, or it's about 84 days a year, where they would have exposure, how they would access the site, their exposures to soil or to other media were very similar. And so from that evaluation of the passive recreator, we determined that the cancer risks were all below acceptable levels. The non-cancer health hazards, however, slightly exceeded the acceptable level of risk. And that was for the adolescent trespasser, limited use passive recreator, and for the adult trespasser and passive recreator. And as you can see, the benchmark of us determining whether or not the risk is unacceptable is 1. And our risks came out to be 3 and 2 for those two populations. Now, it's important to look at those numbers and understand what they mean. It doesn't mean that the risk at a hazard quotient as a hazard index of 1, at a hazard index of 3 is 3 times greater than a hazard index of 1. We're looking at the magnitude of exceedance of that benchmark of 1. We're looking at how much significantly greater than that benchmark is the risk. And at a hazard quotient of 2 and a hazard index of 2 and a hazard index of 3, we are slightly exceeding that value of 1. So we do have risks to these two populations who are exposed at the site. Those risks are driven by these PCBs that Stephanie showed in the earlier slide, were found in about 36% of the site of the samples that we collected. But the risks were pretty low, but we still have unacceptable risks. So that means that we have to look at ways to reduce those risks through the feasibility study. The other thing that I want to bring up before I turn it over to the ecological risk assessment is that we had some lead levels and that we found across the site that were quite high and were concerning to us. And if you remember back, we had about 36% of the samples that we collected also were of concern to us. So we have some lead concentrations as well that do require some consideration in the feasibility study. And with that, I will turn it over to the ecological risk and Mike Clementson.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to give a rundown of the baseline ecological risk assessment conclusions. So the BEAR concluded that chemicals of potential ecological concern, or COPECs, are not a concern for most of the receptors that were evaluated. The COPEC concentrations in soil were generally higher in the terrestrial areas than in the wetland areas. There were no significant differences in biota tissue concentrations between the terrestrial or wetland areas. And some of the lines of evidence showed potential risk to benthic invertebrates, herbivorous mammals, such as the meadow vole, insectivorous mammals, such as the little brown bat, and piscivorous mammals, such as mink. But other lines of evidence indicated that there was no risk. So the kind of overall weight of evidence showed the risks were not significant to those receptors. Some of the COPECs in the two brooks, Lowentaka and Black Brook, were found to be higher upstream of the site than downstream. And the potential risk was noted for worm-eating birds and mammals, which are considered vermivorous receptors. For example, like the shrew, short-tailed shrew, and the American robin. So addressing the risks to these receptors, the shrew and the robin, should address any other potential risks to other receptors, because typically the shrew and the robin are most sensitive. They're eating the worms right out of the soil, so they're going to be more sensitive than the other ones that were evaluated. And I think that's it for me.
Okay, so thank you, Michael and everyone. So now moving on to the feasibility study, which I think is what most of you want to hear about. So as we just went through, we now understand the nature and extent of the contamination at the site, and we understand the risks posed by that contamination. So now the next step is to try to figure out, how do we address those risks? How do we clean up the site? Excuse me. So in order to do that, we use the risk assessment information and the data from the RI to determine our list of contaminants of concern at the site that need to be addressed. We also determine our remedial action objectives. So what are the goals of the cleanup, and to what concentrations, above what concentrations are we concerned about of the contaminants of concern? And then once we understand our goals, then we can develop appropriate alternatives to evaluate. And in the FS process, the feasibility study process, there's a very formal evaluation process that we, I keep using the word process. There are formal steps that we go through to evaluate potential alternatives to clean up a site. So next slide. So first, I'll go through each of these things in a little more detail. So first, based on the site conditions, the results of the risk assessments, the reuse assessment, and a review of the relevant and appropriate requirements for the site, such as the legal requirements and guidance and all of that, we developed the following remedial action objectives. And those are, I'm going to read them: to prevent or minimize current and potential future unacceptable risks to current and potential future human and ecological receptors through direct contact with or ingestion of contaminated soil or sediment. So that's a whole lot of information in one sentence, but that really captures what the first goal of the action would be. And then the second goal of the action would be to control or remove source areas to prevent or minimize impacts to groundwater. So as Supinder went through in the RI review, the impacts to groundwater were not, we did not find a plume of contamination at this site. There were sort of localized areas with elevated concentrations in groundwater. So so the second remedial action objective is basically saying, if we remove those sources of contamination to the shallow groundwater, then that should help address those areas of contamination in the groundwater. I can get into it more later, but in the beginning, at one point, we had been thinking that we would address both soil, sediment, and groundwater all together in one decision document. But as is very often done, and after consultation with EPA headquarters, we have made the decision to address groundwater after soil and sediment. And I can explain that more, but let me get through the alternatives first. So next slide. So the contaminants of concern at the site. So as I said, we go through the risk assessment, and then we also look at the requirements of the state. So an action has been triggered. An action has been triggered at the site. We need to take action to address the risks. So we look at what contaminants are present at the site. We look at the New Jersey laws and regulations, and we developed a list of contaminants of concern and site-specific cleanup goals for those contaminants. So you can see here, there's one VOC, chloroform. There was one area of the site where there must have been some chloroform disposal. So that's not a widespread contaminant of concern. It was really just one location. We found some elevated concentrations of semi-volatile organic compounds. Those are very typically found in any industrial or even urban area. We have the Pcbs, which are the Pcbs, lead, and to a slightly lesser extent arsenic, are the primary, most widespread contaminants of concern at the site. And then for metals, we also have antimony and vanadium. Next slide. So now I'll talk about the alternatives that are evaluated in the draft feasibility study. So there are 5 alternatives evaluated. The first one is no action. EPA law Superfund says we must evaluate no action. You know, what happens if we just walk away and do nothing? Alternative 2 is sort of, you know, very typically you look at a minimal action type alternative. So in this case is just using engineering and institutional controls. So that means things like putting up a fence and putting some deed restrictions on the site. So then alternatives 3, 4, and 5 are the more active ones. Alternatives 3 and 4 are very similar. And basically, and maybe it would be best to talk about this if you go to the next slide. So, yeah, well, I'll point something out on this slide. So here's a figure showing the site again. And you can see at the top portion, there's a gridded area. that's sort of a polygon shape. So that is where the bulk of the elevated PCB concentrations were found. You can also see, or you may not be able to see over Zoom. If we were in person, we would have a full-size map of this figure, but some of the dots are red and some of them are black. Any of the red dots, both within the gridded area and throughout the figure, any of the red dots exceed those preliminary remediation goals and must be addressed. Now, how they are addressed is the question that the three is what differentiates the three alternatives that we haven't discussed yet. So going back to the previous slide, alternative 3 would be capping that PCB area, that odd-shaped polygon in place to reduce the overall risk posed by the site. Capping and or excavating any additional areas that exceed the PRGs. Now, some of those areas significantly exceed the PRGs, and those might be treated differently than areas that just slightly exceed the PRGs. But overall, the remedy would prevent direct contact exposure as per the remedial action objective to any elevated concentrations. The only difference between alternative 3 and alternative 4 is that alternative 4, rather than capping that PCB area in place, it would excavate that area and dispose of it off-site. And then finally, alternative 5 would cap the entire landfilled area. So now moving again to the next slide, I just want to point out a few things on this figure. So first off, if you can see, there are red dots on both the private portion and the fish and wildlife portion of the site. Action is needed on the fish and wildlife managed portion of the site, including one of those areas that requires special consideration. Second, when we talk about the capping the entire landfill, that is what's shown by the pink outline. The pink hashed area to the left of the darker pink outline, I'm sorry, this is hard to describe, is the surface debris area. So that waste would be, there are a few additional elevated concentrations in there that would need to be addressed. But the way the draft FS stands now is the capping would occur over that 140 acres that is outlined in dark pink. And, you know, I just want to explain what a cap would look like. That would mean—
Stephanie, this is Matt. Can you, we're at 6:50. I just want to give you a quick, can you wrap up in the next few minutes?
So I won't talk about what a cap looks like unless somebody asks. Let's move on to the next slide. So there are 9 criteria by which we evaluate a feasibility study, or alternative, sorry. The first 2 are called threshold criteria. Is the alternative protective of human health and the environment, and is it consistent with law? Then there are 5 balancing criteria, and these are all equally weighted. Long-term effectiveness, short-term effectiveness, implementability, can it get done, and reduction of toxicity, mobility, or volume through treatment. And then finally, cost. So each of those criteria would sort of look a little different for each of the alternatives I just described. Evaluation of those criteria is included in the feasibility study, and it will be included. It is included in a proposed plan once one is prepared. The final 2 of the 9 criteria are called the modifying criteria, and those are community and state acceptance. So those criteria cannot be evaluated until we start the public comment period, which we don't know yet when that will start. We have not come out yet with our preferred alternative. So, you know, we are not at that point yet. But as I went through earlier, any comments received during the public comment period will be considered, will be evaluated, will be responded to very formally, and then a record of decision will be issued. So next slide, just 2 slides left. Just to quickly run through things again. The base, and there's a point I didn't make earlier. Baseline ecological risk assessment, the remedial investigation report, and the human health risk assessment have all already been approved. The human health was approved in 2014, but updated in 2018. So that's why that one is showing up later. All of those documents were reviewed by all of the trustees for the site, and the PRPs prepared them. So the state reviewed them and Fish and Wildlife reviewed them. And their comments were incorporated, and they indicated, including Fish and Wildlife indicated, that they do not have any further comments on the ecological risk assessment, the RI, or the human health risk assessment. The draft feasibility study report has been out for a couple of years. We received a revised draft in March, just last month, and we are reviewing it right now. EPA, New Jersey DEP, and Fish and Wildlife Service, as a trustee for the site in their dual role, are all reviewing that draft report. So the next steps are for us to provide comments on the draft feasibility study report, and those will be consolidated comments, as we always do, that we receive from all the parties reviewing it. When we feel the feasibility study report is in, is close to final, we will prepare the proposed plan and finalize the administrative record and release the proposed plan for public comment. I don't have any certainty yet as to when that will be. We are hopeful it will be later this spring, early summer, but it really depends on the feasibility study. And I know we will have some comments on the feasibility study. So final slide. After we sign the record of decision, then there's the next phase of the Superfund process starts. The first thing would be negotiating legal agreements with the responsible parties to conduct the design of the remedial action and the remedial action. And then we would start the very robust pre-design investigation. And that is when we refine the extent of the site to be addressed, determine exactly how much of the site needs to be capped or excavated or whatever the alternative that is selected. And we go on from there. So there are still a lot of steps to go. A couple other things to just mention quickly. During and after implementation of the remedy, there would be lots of sampling conducted. That sampling would include groundwater, pore water, all kinds of sampling, sediment, biota, to assure that the remedy is and remains protective. Some of that data will help us decide on how we need to move forward with groundwater if additional action is needed. And so we will go through this decision process again for groundwater. And even once the groundwater remedy is selected, we will be conducting what are called 5-year reviews at the site on an ongoing basis. Whenever a contamination remains at a site, which all of these alternatives would leave contamination remaining at the site, we review them very formally again every 5 years, which means we're sampling on an ongoing basis forever. That is it. Any questions? Yep. I know we just threw a lot of information at you.
This is where in the agenda we have a number of planned items in the agenda. So I think we're going to stick with the agenda now, and we will have a broader Q&A from the audience down the road. So I think that Sally, you are up next here for this next item.
Okay, am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, so next, thanks. Next up is the TAG consultant. Just so everybody understands, EPA provided a grant to Great Swamp Watershed Association on behalf of the Community Advisory Group in order to hire our own technical advisor to review documents and provide us with their expert advice, since we are primarily lay people. So we have our two consultants on the call this evening, Bob Blauvelt and Fran Schultz. I believe Bob is going to make the presentation. That's actually not a presentation. Bob is going to ask the EPA questions based on his review of the most recent feasibility study. So Christina, if you could unmute Bob. And I think what we decided to do, if I'm not mistaken, as Matt just said, is we're not going to go to the EPA for answers. We want to get most of our questions out there so that everybody understands what the questions are before EPA starts answering. So I think we can leave EPA muted for now. Bob's going to ask his questions. Then again, just sequentially, we have a short presentation, assuming he's still on the call, from one of the CAG members. And then we'll go to answers from EPA and then question and answers from the community. So go for it, Bob.
Thank you. And I'm also unmuted?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you. And appreciate the presentation by EPA. Thank you very much. I think that was helpful for everyone as a little primer for the site. So I've got 4 or 5 comments that lead into questions based on the revised FS. Some of those, probably most of them, you won't be able to answer or you won't be willing to answer tonight. But as Sally indicated, we wanted to get you our thinking on those issues so that they get consolidated into your thinking as the FS moves forward. So we'll start off with an easy one. It's a little bit of a nitpicky one, but on figure 5.2 in the revised FS, there's a reference in one of the notes to an alternative 6. And I don't know if that's a typo or if there was an alternative 6 that was considered at some point, but not included. So if you could just at some point clarify that for us, that'd be great. Moving on to more substantial questions. I'm glad we all can agree that additional data are needed at the site. Clearly, the CAG and Fish and Wildlife do not consider the objectives of the remedial investigation as being obtained. There are, as others have described in the last CAG meeting, and as folks here will continue to express, real concerns about the sampling, the extent of the sampling, and how it was focused. That aside for the moment, what we would like you to consider, and if possible commit to, is taking into account the results of the Fish and Wildlife investigation that's either ongoing or about to begin this year. That was described quite extensively in the last CAG meeting. Clearly those data, that information is going to provide some value and support to how the subsequent remedial alternatives should be evaluated. if you, I put that out there again for you to consider that. As you mentioned, and as described in the RI, there are two modifying factors: acceptance of the remedy by the state, as well as by the community. It's our understanding that DEP has some real issues with alternatives that do not comply with the Legacy Landfill Act. You've been advised of that. I think DEP is still waiting from EPA on a response on how they plan to, or if you plan to comply with those regulations. So as it stands now, in terms of the modifying factor for the state, you don't have agreement with the state of New Jersey as to how to proceed. And clearly, as you'll hear, the CAG is far from convinced that the remedial alternatives described are the most protective for both current and future land uses at both the refuge and at the site. So again, as you move forward with the feasibility study, those modifying factors right now, I think, are going to have to be or should be considered very carefully, because there is no agreement right now on these proposed remedies. The last two comments I have, 3 out of the 4 alternatives that are described, the no action alternative aside, 3 out of the 4 of them allow waste, trash, garbage, refuse, debris, whatever you want to call it, to remain exposed at the surface of a Superfund site that the EPA will now say is okay to use, is what doesn't present a risk anymore. And leaving people's garbage or trash at the surface unmanaged, uncovered, just seems inconsistent with even the most rudimentary environmental protections from both an exposure as well as a physical hazard set of risks. And I urge you to consider that condition as you move forward with the feasibility study. It just seems inconsistent. It just doesn't seem aligned with the ultimate environmental objectives that both the agency and the PRPs would want to allow at this site. Okay, so the last set of comments is that the CAG would like you to consider, as you've done in, say, alternatives 3 or 4, a couple of tweaks to alternative 5, a couple of sub-alternatives to think about. So there's 3 of them that I'll suggest to you. And as Sally might have mentioned, we're certainly willing to write all this down in a more formal way and get it to you, similar to the way Fish and Wildlife have provided you with their comments on the draft. So if you want to call this one alternative 5A, which is to evaluate the use of on-site materials as suitable for capping. Right now, under alternative 5, 90% of the truck traffic into the site almost 100,000 truck trips is related to the importation of the cover material. This in turn, this heavy truck traffic drives the short-term effectiveness consideration in the evaluation, in the remedy process, the evaluation of the remedy towards a poor ranking. However, if suitable material can and is found that on the site and is available for use on the site, it could have a real influence in the overall evaluation of alternative 5. And that's, I don't think it's a heavy lift. It seems to me a day or two with a drill rig and a good geotech engineer could come to a pretty easy decision as to whether or not there are places within the site, within the 150 acres, where material might be suitable for use as cover. Right now, the RI kind of, or the FS rather, kind of dismisses the use of on-site material sort of out of hand. There's no data presented. There's a little bit of speculation about groundwater and dewatering, but a more rigorous view of that could really help open up or improve the thought processes behind alternative 5. Alternative 5B, which these are just my designations, 5B, is the thought of evaluating the use of perhaps not so rigorous a cap on the landfill. Right now, you've got a subtitle D cap proposed, which is appropriate, but perhaps a little a less structured a cap, similar to those may be required by DEP in typical landfill sites, municipal landfill sites. The cost right now in alternative 5 for a subtitle D cap is $234,000 an acre. $234,000 to put down a 200 by 200 foot cap that's an acre, roughly an acre. My own experience, and from what I've read in even EPA's own guidance, is subtitle D landfill caps go for like 200, 250 an acre. And I know New Jersey's expensive, but it's not 1,000 times more expensive. And I really, to look at that subtitle D capping cost and whether or not there is some economy to be had to bring it into a more industry standard type of dollar amount would be a useful process to go through. And finally, my last tweak, which is what I'm calling alternative 5C, the final sub-evaluation that we'd ask you to consider, is looking at recovering the waste from the refuge area. Based on our very rough estimates, there is about 100,000 cubic yards of waste outside the landfill boundaries in the refuge. And if you want, we can lay out how we came to that number. Again, it's a rough number. In alternative 5, as it stands now, you're going to need to import about a 1.1 million tons, about 700,000 cubic yards of cover. material. So if you look at that 700,000 cubic yards, if there is space or if there is suitable material on the landfill property, as we're asking you to look at in 5A, you can excavate that material in a series of borrow pits around the site that aren't going to be really very big, an acre, 2 acres, whatever. And the use of that material as cover will allow for, or may allow for, the waste from the refuse to be consolidated and encapsulated in those borrow pits. So again, that approach reduces the number of amount of truck traffic dramatically, both into the site as well as out of the site. And those borrow pits, they can be located where the waste is if the material is there. And so that the option to start hauling material off the property may not be as necessary in some of the alternatives 3 and 4 that are listed. But those are the main 4 or 5 main points I want to leave you with for you to incorporate into your thinking as you develop the next steps in the FS process.
Thanks, Bob. Can you guys hear me again? Okay. I think there he is. Okay. We'd like to have a short presentation from one of our CAG members who also happens to be an environmental expert. Matt, I'll let you tell us what your qualifications are when you start so that people know that you know what you're talking about. Christina, can you let Matt Palmer have sharing ability? And obviously he's off mute, so that's great. Matt, thank you so much for being able to join us this evening. Really, really appreciate it.
Sure. And I actually don't have slides, so I'll just talk. I don't need to share screen.
Okay.
So thank you. For those who haven't met me yet, my name is Matt Palmer. I am a Chatham Township resident and a member of the CAG. I am also a professional ecologist. I have my PhD in ecology and evolution. I've done a lot of work on wetland ecology, forest ecology, and endangered species biology, where I've done a bunch of work with both rare plants and reptiles and amphibians. I've been a professor at Columbia University for 16 years and trained many students who have gone on to work at the EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service and many other places. But that's just to tell you a little bit about my perspectives that I'm bringing to these concerns. And I've been at I think at all the CAG meetings, and I have been disturbed that it seems that the FS is in some ways biased against the most protective option, which is option 5, which would be to cap the whole site. And Bob just, I think, illustrated what I think some of those biases are. They seem to be ignoring the fact that the Great Swamp is on top of a very, very thick layer of clay, which is exactly what would be used to cap the site. And to say that material would be brought in from offsite, both I think artificially increases the cost and dramatically increases the community impact with respect to truck traffic. And we have pointed this out, and we have been told that the source of the cap material would be part of the design decision. But I will point out to everyone that the design decision comes after a proposed remedy has been chosen. And if you stack the deck prior to choosing a remedy against the thing that looks like it might have community opposition and be very expensive, then that wasn't a legitimate comparison. And so we have asked for that comparison to say, let's look up front before choosing a proposed remedy at those sources and what might that do to the cost, what might that do to the public impact, what might that do to the protectiveness, you might end up with a very different decision. I think Bob illustrated those points pretty well, but I wanted to put it in, I think, maybe a slightly different language. Another way in which I feel that the deck is stacked against option 5 is that it makes statements that option 5 would have negative impacts on the vegetation. I don't want to misquote them, so let me summarize from the table here. Option 5, they say this about short-term effectiveness. This alternative would have greater impacts on the community than alternative 3 and would lead to greater loss of quality habitat and wetlands than alternative 3. I think this is deeply misleading because the quality habitat and wetlands that this document is referring to is garbage that has been overgrown by vegetation for the last several decades. And that vegetation is primarily, about 80% by my site visits and conversations with people very familiar with the site, a mix of Asian bush honeysuckle and mugwort, with the other 20% being introduced Phragmites, or the giant reed grass. There are some scattered trees, many of which are also not native to this part of the country, along these elevated roads. And so to say that they don't want to disturb this quality habitat is mischaracterizing what that habitat is. This habitat is already severely disturbed. These lands used to be red maple swamps, perhaps some cattail marshes, some sedge meadows, other wetlands that through decades of dumping trash are no longer wetlands and are frankly no longer really habitat. And so I feel like that's in some ways biasing against the choice of option 5 to suggest that those are valuable, when in fact those are highly degraded lands. I find this even more disturbing because one of the main reasons why Rolling Knolls is on the national priority list, one of the reasons it is a Superfund site, when there are many thousands of other closed landfills in the United States that haven't made it onto the list yet, the priority ranking to get this site classified identifies the fact that it is adjacent to a fish and wildlife refuge, a federally designated wilderness area, and habitat for several endangered species, including bog turtles, wood turtles, blue-spotted salamanders, a number of other birds and wildlife. And I know, and I can give you chapter and verse if you need, that those animals are not crawling up onto the trash, that the habitat is degraded with respect to endangered species because of the legacy of this landfill. And if the reason that this landfill is a Superfund site is partly because of its adjacency to these critically important natural resources, a solution should take into account the fact that there's a wilderness area right next door and a fish and wildlife refuge right next door and a number of endangered species right next door that could be using this site, that almost certainly were using this site prior to it becoming a landfill. And some of the options that Bob just laid out, the idea of, perhaps consolidating some of the waste, pulling it back off of the wetlands that it buried when the waste was deposited, would allow for ecological restoration, would allow for the reestablishment of wetland forests, would allow for the reestablishment of habitat for these endangered species, which is part of the reason for this ever being on the national priority list at all. Now, we've been told in prior meetings that the goal here is to limit human health exposures and to limit eco risk, this eco health exposures. And what they looked at was that these are relatively straightforward models for whether or not these contaminants are going to get into the worms, and then those worms are going to get eaten by the robins and the shrews. And some of them are. But the robins and the shrews are not the reason this is on the national priority list. The blue-spotted salamanders and the bog turtles and the Cooper's hawks and all of these other endangered species are the reason that that got all the extra points on the national priority list, and they're not involved here at all. And I've mentioned this idea that couldn't we have some goals for ecological restoration as a part of this as well? And the remedial action objectives that the EPA have identified, I think are too narrow. They don't talk about ecological revitalization. They don't talk about the rare species or endangered species at all. And I've been told, well, that's not really the point of Superfund. Superfund is to manage these health risks and these eco risks, which I'll argue are very narrowly defined here. But that's not entirely true, because if you look at other EPA documents, there are lots and lots of examples of Superfund sites having ecological revitalization programs. I looked at a lot of nice photographs of wetland restorations on former Superfund sites, and they weren't even ones that were adjacent to federal wilderness areas. And so the scope is too narrow here. We haven't considered the broader range of what this site could be in terms of some of these remedial actions. And I'm not sure why that's the case, especially because EPA has done it many other times before on many other Superfund sites, ones that didn't even necessarily have all of this same justification for the wilderness issues or for the endangered species issues. And so I'm concerned that we're in some ways missing what makes this site so special. And so the other major point that I'd like to make before we go over to the Q&A is we've talked a little bit about the medium to long term for this site. And I know, and several of us from the CAG have spoken up about the desire to have more public access and trails. There is a nice pond there that might be an opportunity for recreational fishing. This could potentially be a really valuable bit of open space. And we are frequently told, well, this is a private property. And that private property in all of the options except for one, which we're not really considering, but 2, 3, and 4 is all going to get closed off with a fence for no public access. And if this was private property for which there was never any plan to have public access, then maybe that would be okay. But I'd like you all to know that that is not the desired end goal for this property. The private owner of this property, the Mealy Trust, doesn't want to maintain a fence in perpetuity and keep people off of it. They would actually like to see some positive reuse of the site, which is entirely consistent with Superfund goals. A better use of the site after the Superfund remediation is done. The Mealy Trust has expressed a desire to sell or perhaps even to give the land to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or to Chatham Township as open space. And when that happened, we wouldn't be talking about trespasser level access. We would be talking about amenities for the people in the community and the state and the nation, right? Anybody could come and hike those trails and watch birds and fish in the pond and enjoy this landscape. This is 140 acres of Chatham Township land that could be restored to a much higher ecological state and to one which we could have much more access and much greater use than is being envisioned by options 1, 2, 3, or 4. And if the only one that gets us anywhere toward safe public access and some of these broader and more valuable long-term uses is option 5, and the deck is so heavily stacked against option 5 under, I think, frankly, misleading estimates of cost and truck traffic and the value of what's there, to me is just not listening. And it's a terrible missed opportunity. I've said my piece.
Thanks, Matt. Sally, did you want to say anything before I transition here?
Yeah, I think we wanted to let EPA jump in and see if they wanted to answer any of what's already been asked, which I know is a lot. And if they want to defer, that's okay. But I want to give them a chance to answer that conglomerate of questions before we open it up to everybody else's questions. So maybe for 10 or 15 minutes if they want to do that. Otherwise, we can just go on to more questions and put these to you in writing. But I'd love to hear some answers if you'd like. If I leave that to EPA, if you'd like to go.
I can.
Okay.
I can give a quick answer to the first comments that the technical advisor made. That the figure 5.2 That is a typo, basically. It was a holdover from the first draft of the FS when we were still considering a residential scenario. So we've already told the PRPs to remove that language from the FS. And if you saw the yellow on the figure. I don't know, I'd have to take a moment to read through the other comments. I don't know if anyone else on the line wants to address any of them.
Well, I think
This
there's,
is
sorry,
Juan.
go
this
ahead,
is-
Juan.
I'm not sure why I can't see myself in here. There was a lot said. Matthew was very impassioned, and we heard you. And all of the items that were raised today, we'll take back and we'll consider them. There were a lot of asks there that we have to think about. Ultimately, we are going to follow the Superfund process as it's laid out in CERCLA and the NCP. Some of the discussion, I think, today really is better suited for natural resource damages. And there is another aspect. It's not totally correct to say that Superfund is only about remediation. Our work at EPA and the Superfund program is about remediation. But there are aspects of Superfund that deal with natural resource damages, and that goes to the ideas of restoration a little bit more on point. But the main takeaway that I want you to take is that we have heard you, we've listed it, we've written down the comments that were made today, and we will consider those asks.
So question, since we do have a tentative meeting, if we need it, scheduled for, what did I say, a week from Tuesday, the 27th? Why don't we get the rest of the questions asked? And if there are questions that you can answer tonight, that would be great. And how about if we regroup on the 27th, and then you'll be able to answer the questions. And hopefully, Bob Blauvelt, I lost where you are on my screen, but hopefully we'll be able to get them to you in writing shortly, although I'm sure you've taken copious notes between the many EPA representatives on the call, and not to mention it's recorded, so you can always take a look at them. But
I didn't want to leave you, and maybe I did, I didn't want to leave you with the impression that we're going to come back at another meeting and answer all of these asks at another meeting. We're going to take them back. We're going to consider them. And there may be some things that we can answer to you directly and other things that will just come out through the process.
well, I would certainly think that the CAG should be part of that process. I mean, if the whole point is for us to have a way to participate, if we're just asking questions and not getting answers until the next draft of the FS, I don't really feel that that's giving us an adequate opportunity to fully participate.
Well, you are participating. That's what the point of these meetings are. And we do respond as soon as we can and as well as we can. But there's a lot of things that were asked here tonight that are really part of the FS process. And you deal with them in the FS process. But I think that you should give us the opportunity to go back and look at them. And if there is another meeting, which it sounds like there's going to be another meeting, we'll answer as many and maybe all if we can.
Yeah, I think it's just some of them may take more than a week to answer is part of the point.
What I'd like to do is let everybody else continue to ask their questions, because fortunately we do have some more time, and whatever you can answer tonight would be great. I'd like to have that meeting on the 27th when you can answer whatever questions you can at that point. That's, is that 10, 12 days from now? And then whatever you can't answer, we'll push to the next time. But we're getting concerned from the community's perspective that we're running out of our window to ask questions and get answers before you release a final draft FS. So we would like more answers sooner rather than later, so that we feel that we're being heard.
Can I make a comment regarding that statement you just made? Or I don't know if Angela, you want to address this, because I feel like I've said it and maybe you would say it in different words. But just the fact that once the proposed plan is released, then we start this public comment period. So the notion that this is your last chance to submit comments, it's just, you will still have ample opportunity to submit comments once we sort of put out a document that we're comfortable with. Right now, we have a draft document, we're reviewing it, we know we have comments, we know we have concerns with it. So it's just, I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that this is the last opportunity. We haven't even started the comment period. I don't know if there's a better way of saying that. Or...
No, I thank you, Stephanie. I would like to stress, we don't have a projected date for this, release of the proposed plan, and that will provide yet another opportunity for people to go on the record formally and have those comments as part of the decision-making record process. And that includes the feasibility study. People tend to forget that that's a document that's not finalized until the ROD is signed. So there will be other opportunities. So there's been a tremendous amount of information provided. And yes, Sally, I took copious notes, as did everyone else. My hand is a little cramped. I feel like I'm back in grad school. And I think really you guys have given us a lot to discuss internally as a team. And I don't know that there would be a lot of value in trying to give you some off-the-cuff thoughts on what has been presented. Some of this is information that I think we have heard something similar from Fish and Wildlife previously. So we may or may not have some thoughts on this, like, in the back of our minds. But I would like to talk to our team a little bit more about all the things that we've heard tonight, and so that we could get back and actually, provide you with what responses we can. Some may not be, immediately forthcoming. Some might, require a bit more research, consideration, and I think trying to, address all of these tonight, including 3 potential tweaks to alternative 5, I don't think that we're going to be able to do it in 26 minutes. So maybe it would be best if we get other questions out on the table so that people can ask their questions. And then if we can't address them tonight, then we could do so kind of in an iterative fashion at the next meeting.
Great. That sounds great. Matt Roby, I know somebody chatted me who may have meant to chat everyone. Joe Basralian would like to ask a question. And then if you want to go to the questions that were put in the chat, that'd be great also.
Sure. All right. So thanks, Sally. And
I'm sorry, Christina, do you want to unmute everyone?
Yeah, sure. I can unmute just, let's see. So everybody right now is muted. They can unmute themselves right now. So I think Matt wanted to say something about.
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks, Stephanie and Angela and Juan, for responding. There were 2 comments that that arose earlier in I think the FS presentation. The first one was, what are the exact dates for the review and comment period, and when is the public meeting being scheduled? So that's definitely for a question for EPA.
Yeah, and this is Angela. I think we've kind of made it clear that we're not at that point yet. We don't have a definite date. Heck, we don't have a conceptual date right now. So I think that's something that we'll be able to provide some more information on in the future months, but nothing at the present time. And there is a statutory requirement for a 30-day public comment period once we release the proposed plan. So you know, there'll be time to take a look at things.
Matt, can I just elaborate on that question? That was my
Yeah.
question. Tracy Knapp from Chatham Township. I think what I'm trying to understand is we want to give input and direction prior to a cleanup remedy being selected. So where does that fit into the, I don't want to, I'm not looking at the 30-day comment period post the remediation action or the record of the ROD, the record of decision being made. How do we in Chatham Township get our information to you about what's desirable for our town where the landfill is? Where does that process happen?
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I think with this has come back and forth a couple of different times. And I want to say one thing. This is Matt, and then Stephanie and your team. I think that's definitely a response that's needed from EPA. We've talked about the remedial investigation, the feasibility study, and the proposed plan, and then the record of decision. And so the record of decision isn't made until after the public comment period. And so the EPA has yet to choose a preferred alternative. And at the proposed plan stage is when EPA will say, this is the preferred alternative. We're proposing this as the remedy. And the public comment period is part of the selection of that ROD. And so it's not so much of an after the fact process, not after the fact public comment period, but a part of the process.
I just wanted clarification because I heard 60 days, 90 days, then I heard
Yeah.
a 30-day public comment period.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know what the 60 to 90 day period is because there were comments being received during that time, as I understood the conversation to be. And then there's the record of decision and then a 30-day comment period. So maybe I'm not understanding it. So Stephanie, maybe you could go through that again.
Sure. So Matt had it correct. So once we are comfortable with the feasibility study, we will prepare a proposed plan. That proposed plan will indicate, will describe the whole site, but it will also indicate EPA's preferred alternative. So it won't select the alternative, but it'll propose, this is how we think we should move forward. And when we release that proposed plan publicly, not just to the CAG, but to a very wide audience, that is what starts a mandatory minimum 30-day public comment period. Now, people can ask for an extension of that comment period as well. So maybe that's where you heard the 60 or 90. So once the comment period starts, then everyone will have the opportunity to review the entire, what we call administrative record. So the administrative record will include the proposed plan, but it will also include the RI report, the risk assessments, the feasibility study, and all of that is open for comment. So in the middle of the 30-day comment period, we will have a public meeting that, as many people who want to attend can attend. That is recorded by a stenographer, every word said, and we'll make a presentation and present an overview of the site, much like what we did tonight, but we'll include what our preferred alternative is. At this point, all through what I'm describing, we have not selected a remedy. Once the comment period ends, whether that's after 30 days or a longer period if an extension is requested, then we will take all the comments we received, whether they're verbally during the meetings or in writing, and we will evaluate them. That evaluation process, depending how many comments we get and how extensive the comments are, could take a long time. It could take months. So we will evaluate all those comments. We will prepare what's called a responsiveness summary, and we will write the record of decision. And that is where those last two, one of the comments made was about we need to take into account those modifying criteria of state and community acceptance. We can't start evaluating those modifying criteria until we start the public comment period, until we put out the proposed plan. So that's what I was trying to say before too, that this is not your last opportunity to provide input. We have not started the formal, we're asking for your input process yet. We're meeting with you as the CAG to get your input all throughout, but there is still to come the formal part of that. Did that clarify things?
It clarifies it. I'm not comfortable with it, but it clarifies it.
But that just FYI is the standard EPA process in our laws that we need to, I guess, could I ask what the discomfort is with that process?
I want to make sure that all the people, the representatives here that are on the CAG and representatives, residents of Green Village, as well as, you know, our open space and all of those things, because this is happening in our town. And the, you know, what the scope of the remediation actions, the 5 different alternatives plus the alternatives that were mentioned tonight, which were not considered, that's concerning. We have a 170 acre site in our town that is what decision is going to be made. We get 30 days to have input to, so that makes me uncomfortable. My time and let other people talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to say a couple of things. One is that we're taking your input now. So these are opportunities at these meetings to share your concerns and your views. The other thing is that we could receive comments during the public comment period that make us change the remedy or modify the remedy. So your voice is valuable and it will be heard.
Okay, let's move on to another question. There are a couple of questions. There are a couple of comments here coming in. I don't know that these are questions. I think these look like, for the most part, in the comments are reiterations of what has been said. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Matt, it looks
or any
like
additional comments.
Both have questions.
If I could go after Kathy, if you prefer to go first, Kathy, thank you.
Sure. I wanted to know why in the mentioning of the capping, it had to be site-wide instead of consolidating the contaminants and capping only portions, and therefore allowing for possibly allowing for wetlands to be to thrive after it's all over.
I think EPA, you're taking in questions in groups. Do you want to answer? I have a similar question.
Yeah, Stephanie, do you want to just keep taking the questions and we'll do answers on the 27th, or do you want to go case by case and answer some if you?
I guess since they're taking notes, I can just pile on and you won't forget Kathy's comment. But so thank you, EPA, for keeping an open mind. That's very encouraging. Regarding the process, I think we should all know that this process now, discussing the alternatives in the feasibility study, is a far greater opportunity to potentially alter the outcome because there is not a real set of options here. It is a very narrow set of options, in my opinion, in the feasibility study. And once one of those options is chosen and we're given 30 or 60 days or whatever in the public comment period afterwards, we have far more limited ability to change the outcome. And we already know that EPA has already predominantly made their decision and starts building on momentum on that decision. So unlike Matt Palmer, I do not have any a scientific background. And I do not come at, this is my first CAG meeting. And, but I can tell what I think are some basic realities when I look at them. The options now that you've given in the feasibility study, they all involve removing waste and then bringing in lots of cap and fill. They're all pretty similar. And I agree with Matt Palmer that the language seems heavily biased against number 5. So what I think a real alternative, if we wanted to have real alternatives in the feasibility study, we would change one of them to include consolidate existing material in place on the site, use on-site materials to cap, and then instead of having all this fencing, it's basically skull and crossbones forever. Then you'd have it be open and available to all. That to me would be a real alternative, because you could drastically reduce truck traffic if you're not taking as much material off. But more importantly, you're not trucking in thousands of trucks. You could use a lot of that. The truck traffic to and from the site would be drastically reduced. And more importantly, I was kind of disturbed to hear, well, it's private property right now, so we wouldn't get public access anyway. It's private property now, but we all know that we're talking about eternity. We know that private property changes hands. We know the National Wildlife Refuge's approved acquisition zone. Over time, we would expect a lot of lightly used land to go over into the public trust. And on that last point, we only have 5 National Wildlife Refuges in New Jersey. We only have 567 in the nation. I feel we have to seriously consider doing something that allows genuine public access to this site over the long term. We're not just talking during our lifetimes, we're talking forever. And we also have to care about the people who live in the neighborhoods now. A consolidate and cap and use cap materials in place would dramatically reduce truck traffic. So I would urge EPA, which I know you have an open mind, to consider changing the feasibility study so that there's a genuine alternative rather than just four alternatives that seem just to be about driving stuff off the site, driving stuff on, and ending up with skull and crossbones on site at the end of the day anyway.
Thanks, Joe.
We have one other comment from question from Kathy O'Leary. Were the sites with wetland restoration on sites with that were entirely capped? I think that might be in reference to what Matt Palmer was talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, in part. I just would like to also say that, I am a member of the CAG, and this is the first that I'm hearing Matt speak about this in this great of a length. And there is not necessarily consensus on the CAG with regard to what Matt presented, just for those people who are tuning in for the first time. So yes, I would like for the members of the public to understand whether or not, first of all, I asked questions about the vernal pools as well. An entirely capped site, wouldn't that eliminate those vernal pools? And those vernal pools are those where the blue-spotted salamanders are spawning? And have we done any mapping or investigation of those vernal pools? And also, on an entirely capped site, I do live down the street from a Superfund site that's been delisted that has a capped area. We are not permitted to walk on the cap. So is that a given that an entirely capped site would allow for public access? Based on the engineering controls that might be in place.
Mike Horn, I'm actually going to ask you if you wouldn't mind jumping in. Just, you can't answer for EPA on rolling knolls, but perhaps you could give Kathy an example from OU3, which is, I don't know, is it a mile away, also on the refuge, and it's a capped site, and you could just tell her how that functions.
Sure. So Kathy, I think the first part of your question is the habitat that you're referring to where blue-spotted salamanders occur. I would think, and what I've seen of the site, those vernal pools are there, but they exist in the primarily undisturbed segments of the site where there isn't a lot of waste deposited. So I don't think that a cap of the waste area is going to interfere at all with because the habitat for them just isn't there from my observations, and we could.
Right, but that wasn't what Matt was proposing, a cap of the entire site, so that would include the vernal pools. Is that? Am I?
I'm sorry, Kathy. I think you maybe didn't understand me. I am not proposing a cap of the entire site.
Okay.
So and then the other thing. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Matt.
I was going to say a point I tried to make and perhaps didn't make clearly is I would like to be thinking about ecological restoration or ecological revitalization and thinking about the habitat for rare and endangered species, including the blue-spotted salamander. And what I think would be the most effective for that would be some consolidation of the waste to get back down to the wetland grade and to allow for wetland restorations to happen there.
Thank you.
So then, Kathy, I think the second part of your question was related to public access. And so I can only really speak, I can speak to that in a couple of ways because we implement it in a couple of ways. We have 2 other landfills on the refuge, and access to them is a little different in both cases. But the closest landfill, the one that also occurs in our wilderness area, about a mile downstream from the Rolling Knolls landfill, is open to the public, and as is the entire wilderness area open to the public. We have wilderness access trails, but people are not restricted to those trails. And so that also applies, at least theoretically, if somebody would want to walk on our portion of the Rolling Knolls landfill. Those are issues that we have to work through as part of this evaluation. But it is totally possible to have a capped landfill that has full access for public use. And there are numerous examples of that in the state of New Jersey, including some examples where there are soccer fields and baseball fields and things like that nature on them, but also areas like we've talked about all along, which is, passive recreation, wildlife related recreation. So there's lots of opportunities on landfills for that type of use, but the time to consider those options is early on in the process. So I guess, does that help?
Yes, but I mean, I think my point was it's not necessarily a given that a cap. I mean, it depends upon the design of the cap, right? As to whether or not there'll be access.
Yeah, I think that should be a design element or considered as part of the design, depending on what that planned future use might be. So you could design a cap with public use in mind or not. And I think that the range of options presented in the FS as it currently exists represents that range. Everything from people not being able to access, no matter who owns the property in the future, to a less restricted and more public use access options. So I think that's a fair statement of the range of options we're talking about tonight.
Thank you.
Stephanie, I don't want to cut off EPA if they would like to answer that question. I just knew that Mike had an example of a capped superfund that he could discuss. So if you guys want to answer Kathy's question as well.
We could. It's a bigger conversation. So maybe it's best to leave that for the next meeting, and hopefully, Kathy, you can attend.
Okay.
Can I ask EPA a question? Which of the alternatives, which would you consider to be capping alternatives?
So that's a fair question. I mean, alternatives 3, 4, and 5 all include capping. 3 and 4 are consolidation of waste under a cap, and just not necessarily in the way that has been some of the ways that have been suggested tonight, but it is effectively consolidation of waste in a 25-acre area of the site. And alternative 5 would be capping the entire site.
Thanks.
I have a question, but I want to make sure that kind of the public has more of an opportunity to ask, since I have a little bit more access. So is there anybody else on the call that would like to ask a question?
Can I make one other point? Sorry, that I just in response to the previous conversation about capping and just and Michael could jump in here, but the risks that we evaluated, that the risk assessment did look at passive recreational use of the entire site, whether it was termed trespassing or not, because regardless of future plans, right now that the majority of the site is privately owned and there's a restrictive covenants on it. So, but the assumptions used for the trespasser or the passive recreator are the same. So those alternatives would be protective of someone using the site as would be imagined for the wilderness area, like hiking or bird watching. I just want to make that clear that even though it says trespasser, because if the owner is telling us they don't want anyone on the property, it doesn't mean it would not be protective to use the site in that way if these alternatives were implemented. Michael?
No, I think you summarized it correctly. I think it's a little bit not correct to just focus on the term, but rather to focus on how we define the exposure for that population. And like I was trying to say earlier, the scenario that we identified for people who are accessing the site now is about 84 days per year. And in a previous presentation to the CAG, we went through how that's identified. It's based on a number of days per year in the summer months, number of days per week in the summer months. I think it's 5 days per week in the 13 weeks of summer. It's 3 days a week in the 26 weeks of spring and fall when the temperature is above 50 degrees. And then it is no days of exposure in the 3 months when the temperature is below 50 degrees. That doesn't mean that we don't anticipate people ever being out there when it's not 50 degrees or when it's below 50 degrees. That's just kind of an average way that we've identified how people might be exposed to the site. And so whether that we're calling that exposure a trespasser because, as Stephanie said, access to private land that where the owner doesn't want people on it is called trespassing, or whether that exposure is through walking trails at the National Wildlife Refuge, that is still a very similar exposure scenario. So that's, I think, the important thing to focus on.
Actually leads so directly into one of my many questions, but the one that I'll ask, and then I have one minor clarification one, and then I guess we should wrap up. Michael, you mentioned that you address reasonably anticipated use, and you're saying passive recreation and trespassing, although trespassing is sort of euphemistic. But why isn't public ownership of the property in the future addressed? It is my understanding that the privately owned property and the property owner is more than willing to convey that property so that it would be publicly accessible. And I would anticipate that the residents of Britton Road would go out and walk their dog or go for an evening stroll a lot more than 84 days a year, as would probably many Chatham residents. So I don't quite understand why 84 days. I mean, I understand calculated X number of days in each season and over a certain temperature, but that just doesn't strike me as realistic if the property becomes cleaned up to a standard that satisfies either the refuge or the township, and it becomes open space as either part of the refuge or part of the township open space. So I would think that needs to be evaluated differently.
So that's a great question, and I think that's a concern that I've heard from, and EPA has heard from a number of the folks from the CAG this evening. And EPA has guidance on reasonably anticipated future land use and how we determine that, because there are lots of factors that come into play. And one of the things that we look at is who owns the land and what do they want to do with it. And we have a privately owned property, and the conversations that took place when we were trying to evaluate what the reasonably anticipated future land use was included conversations with that property owner who agreed to this restricted covenant, I think is what Stephanie called it, that prohibited access to his property. So, or that limited access or that required
Limits
certain control
use.
on his property.
It
Okay.
limits use.
So as a result of that, it was concluded that that limited use or that restrictive covenant was an effective mechanism for us to consider when we were determining the reasonably anticipated future land use. We don't know what will happen 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. We can only draw conclusions based on the lines of evidence and the information that we have today. Right now, we have a privately owned property where the property owner has a restrictive covenant that limits use and does not allow for redevelopment or does not allow for access. So based on that, our reasonably anticipated future use is that that will continue. And that is how we made that determination.
And what if those facts have changed?
If the facts change in the future, then we would reevaluate that at the time. But, you know,
But what if the
I
facts
can't,
have changed now?
If you're aware that the facts have changed now, then please, let us
Yeah.
know that information. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Sally, if you're aware that the facts have changed, let's stay on after this call is over and we can talk.
Okay, that would be great. And then I know it's 8:02. I'm trying to be respectful of people's times. My last question is in one of the very earliest slides, I think when it was timeframes. I don't want to go back to the slides, but one of them said that you were anticipating, I don't know if that's the right word, that the FS would be released late spring, early summer. But then in dialogue, you seem to not have that time frame spelled out. Can we get any clarification on whether we're anticipating late spring? Because I would call this mid-spring right now.
So the word on the slide, I just looked at my copy, is tentative.
Tentative.
We're a large organization. We try to plan. So right now in our planning, we're thinking tentatively it would be late spring, early summer, June-ish timeframe. Now that said, we made that tentative sort of planning decision prior to receiving the revised draft FS. So as we're doing it, if we have more concerns with it than we anticipated, then that might get extended. If we have fewer concerns with it than we anticipated, that might move up. So it was nothing more than that.
Does anybody else have any burning questions they'd like to ask this evening? Otherwise, please plan, all of you, please plan on, what did I say, April 27th at 6 o'clock. I will obviously email everybody with the new Zoom link. Fran, you have a question. You have to unmute.
I hope this is a very quick question. Sally, could we get comments put together in writing that maybe we could review and share with EPA before the meeting?
I would love to do that.
I don't know how EPA feels about that, but I throw that out there so that they're not being kind of surprised at the last minute and they might have some time to prepare some responses.
Yeah, I know I have questions I didn't have a chance to ask because I tried to hold back so other people could ask theirs.
So I could compile comments from people in writing. And
Well, I
send
think
them
the
to
consultant, will do theirs and I'll just add mine to theirs. But if, I don't know, it might be easier if anybody just emails me so that they're all in the same document. I'm happy to do that.
That sounds good. I do have a record of all of the comments here from everything that was said here in the chat. And I'm going to include them with the minutes, even if they weren't responded to.
Great. Okay, I can only see, what am I looking at? 25 people at a time, and I know there's over 50. So if anybody that I can't see, I'm not trying to ignore you. Oh, there's Dot. Dot's raising her hand.
Dot is raising her hand.
Go for it. Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
I'd like to see a cost estimate of the consolidating and capping with on-site material alternative. If the EPA can generate estimates for their chosen 5 alternatives, I don't see why they can't prepare a cost estimate for a much simpler solution, consolidating and capping just the consolidated material. I'd like
With on-site material.
With on-site material. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be able to have some numbers.
Yeah, we will discuss that. I can't guarantee that we would have that in time for the 27th. I know it seems straightforward, but it's more complicated than it sounds.
So Sally, just before we go, are you envisioning that we will regroup on the agenda for what the meeting on the 27th will be? Or are you saying that it's going to be a continuation of what we're doing here, or that EPA is going to respond to a whole range of questions? I just want to be clear about where we're headed.
I think it'll be a continuation of this evening, where EPA will have had the opportunity to review the questions that we've asked that they haven't had a chance to answer. I'll try to get them as many more questions in writing. You know, I know the consultant will summarize their questions. I'll add mine in. Please, if anyone else has questions. So we'll try to get them to them in advance. That no guarantee. I mean, I'm sure there will be other questions that will come up that evening, but we should have a really good head start. I know there was one other Chatham community resident who wanted to make a presentation, a PowerPoint with some information, and I asked if he could hold that off because I knew there would just be too many questions and it was a packed agenda. So I'd like to give him that opportunity. I think that'll be about 10 minutes, you know, on the 27th. That answer, good?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And Michael, I'm happy to stay on if you want to chat for a couple minutes.
Sure.